The air in room 807 of Harlington Private Hospital always felt cold, no matter how high the heater was turned. Victoria Hart, a quiet but sharp-eyed nurse in her early 30s, had worked here long enough to know that the rich often had a way of bringing their own kind of chill. She never imagined her routine would change the way it did the morning Mr. Langston arrived. Jonathan Langston, billionaire, tech mogul, and famously reclusive. He was worth over $30 billion, but now he lay in that stark white room, with tubes in his arms, a body slowly surrendering to a terminal neurological disease that no money could buy a cure for. Victoria was assigned as his night nurse. She didn't speak much to him the first few days. He rarely spoke at all. He mostly watched the window, coughing in silence, with a look in his eyes that made her think he was counting the things he couldn't fix. Then one night everything changed. It was past midnight. She was checking his vitals when his dry voice cut through the silence. "Nurse Hart, may I ask you something unusual?" Victoria turned to him. He was looking straight at her for the first time since she'd met him. His eyes weren't just tired, they were haunted. "Of course, Mr. Langston," she replied, gently. He stared at her for a long time before speaking again. "My daughter. Her name is Alina. I haven't seen her in over 10 years. We left things on bad terms." Victoria waited. She could feel something heavy building in the room. "I don't think I'll live to see next week," he said plainly. "And she won't return my calls, won't even acknowledge me. But tomorrow, I've asked my lawyers to come. I want to see her just once." Victoria's breath caught slightly, unsure where this was going. "I need you," he said, locking eyes with her, "to pretend to be her." Her face stiffened with confusion. "Mr. Langston, I just need one day," he said, "just tomorrow. Sit with me. Call me Dad. Let me believe just for a moment that I didn't die a stranger to my only child." "Why me?" she whispered, unsure what else to say. "Because you look like her," he said with a sad smile. "And because you're kind." Victoria was stunned. Her ethics, her training, everything inside her screamed this was a line she shouldn't cross. But then she saw the man again. Fragile, not powerful, dying, not feared, just a father, or what was left of one. "I can pay you whatever you want," he added, though there was no arrogance in his tone. "This isn't about money, it's about going in peace." Victoria looked down, then out the window, as if searching for some answer outside the walls of this quiet prison. She didn't need the money. Her job paid enough to live modestly. But something in her heart hesitated, not out of greed, but from a place she hadn't visited in years. She too knew what it felt like to be abandoned by a father. "I'll do it," she said quietly, still unsure if she meant it out of compassion, or some broken part of her wanting to feel like someone's daughter again, even if it was a lie. Jonathan exhaled in deep relief. "Thank you, Alina," he whispered. Victoria felt a strange weight settle in her chest. She wasn't Alina. She was Victoria. But tomorrow she would step into a role that wasn't hers, for a man who had run out of time. She didn't know that pretending to be someone else would make her question everything about who she really was. Victoria barely slept that night. She kept staring at her ceiling, wondering how she had agreed to something so twisted, pretending to be someone's daughter. Not just anyone's, Jonathan Langston's, a man who hadn't spoken to his child in a decade, a man who built an empire from code and concrete but couldn't keep his own blood in his life. She thought of her own father, the man who disappeared when she was 12. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence. Maybe that was why she agreed. Some fragile hope that stepping into Alina's shoes would fill a space in her own heart that had been empty for years. She arrived early the next morning, dressed in casual clothes instead of her uniform. Jonathan had requested it. She wouldn't wear scrubs, he'd said with a bitter chuckle. A personal stylist had dropped off options for her to choose from, expensive things. A beige cashmere sweater, dark jeans, soft leather boots. She picked something modest but clean, enough to look like someone from his world without losing herself in it. When she entered room 807, the energy was different. Jonathan was sitting, upright, a thin smile stretched across his tired face. There were fresh flowers on the table. The blinds were open, letting in soft sunlight that made the room feel less like a tomb. "You came," he said softly. She nodded. "Good morning." The word caught in her throat. It felt foreign, like tasting a food you used to love but hadn't had in years. He closed his eyes, and for a second he looked like a man who could finally breathe. "Come sit," he said, patting the chair beside him. She sat. He looked at her, really looked, searching her face for pieces of his daughter. Victoria wasn't sure what he was seeing, but something in his expression softened. Maybe he saw what he wanted. Maybe he just needed to pretend. "You look well," he said. Victoria gave a small smile. "So do you." That was a lie, but she figured that's what Alina would say, or what he wanted her to say. They sat in silence for a while. He reached out and gently took her hand. His fingers trembled, veins like raised wires beneath his skin. But there was warmth and need. "I know I was a terrible father," he said, voice brittle, "but I loved you, Alina. I always did." Victoria didn't respond right away. She didn't know what to say. What would Alina say? What would she say if her own father ever returned from the void? "Then why did you leave?" she asked quietly, not sure if the question was hers or Alina's. Jonathan's eyes glistened. "Because I thought I was doing what was right, building something for you. For us. I told myself the sacrifice was worth it. That time lost could be bought back. But I was wrong." He looked away, ashamed. Victoria stared at him, surprised by how genuine his pain seemed. This wasn't a man making excuses. This was a man who knew he'd wasted something sacred. "What would you do differently?" she asked. "I would have shown up," he said. "For every birthday, every bad day, every first and last. I would have told you that nothing mattered more than you." A lump formed in Victoria's throat, not because of the story, but because no one had ever said those words to her. "Why now?" she asked. "Why pretend? Why not face the truth?" "Because the truth is cruel," he whispered. "The truth is a daughter who won't answer my calls, who doesn't even hate me. She's just done. I'm not strong enough to die with that being my last memory of her." Victoria blinked rapidly. She hadn't expected this. She thought this would be a rich man's delusion, an ego trip. But it wasn't. It was raw and broken and human. Just then the door opened. A woman in a sleek black suit walked in, carrying a folder. His attorney. "Mr. Langston," she said professionally, "are you ready to proceed with the signing?" He nodded. "Yes, this is my daughter Alina. She'll be witnessing." Victoria's chest tightened. She looked at the folder. Legal documents. She didn't even know what they were for. The lawyer handed over the pages, letting them both read. It was an updated will. Jonathan was leaving everything, his entire estate, companies, properties, billions, to his daughter, to Alina Langston. Victoria stared at the lines of print. It wasn't just a play. It was a transfer of legacy, power, history. And it didn't belong to her. She hesitated. "Mr. Langston, are you sure?" He gripped her hand tighter. "Please, I want it done now, today." Victoria's hands shook as she signed her name. Alina Langston. It was forgery, a lie, a sin, but it was also a gift to a dying man who had nothing else left. After the lawyer left, Jonathan sighed with what sounded like peace. "Now I can go," he said softly. "Don't say that," she replied, startled by how her voice cracked. He smiled at her, eyes kind. "You gave me something I didn't deserve. One moment of forgiveness. You may not be my real daughter, but for today you were everything I needed." Victoria's heart twisted. She wanted to cry, not for him, for herself, because she didn't know if anyone in her life had ever needed her that much. Not her father, not anyone, and she didn't know how to let that go. Victoria left room 807 that afternoon, with a strange heaviness pressing on her chest. It wasn't guilt exactly, at least not the loud, sharp kind. It was quieter, like a knot behind her ribs. She kept replaying his words. "You may not be my real daughter, but for today you were everything I needed. It should have ended there, a favor done. Hey, dying man, finally at peace. A one-day role played to soothe someone else's regrets. But life had a way of stretching lies further than you meant them to go. The next morning, just after her shift ended, Victoria was called to the hospital administrator's office. She walked in with calm professionalism, but something felt off the second she opened the door. Inside was Mr. Kemp, the admin, stiff and pale. Beside him sat a woman in her late 20s with straight black hair, designer sunglasses on her head, and a leather jacket that probably cost more than Victoria's monthly salary. The woman turned slowly. Her eyes were the same grey-blue shade as Jonathan Langston's, cold and precise. "Victoria Hart," Mr. Kemp began, swallowing hard. "This is—" "Alina Langston," the woman interrupted, standing. Her gaze drilled into Victoria's face, like she was dissecting her with her eyes. Victoria's heart skipped. So this was her, the real daughter, the one who was supposed to be in that chair, holding his hand, the one who hadn't answered his calls. Alina took a step closer. "My father's attorney called me last night. Apparently, I visited him yesterday and signed off on his entire estate." Mr. Kemp cleared his throat nervously. "Of course, there must be some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Alina said flatly. She looked Victoria dead in the eyes. "You impersonated me." Victoria tried to speak, but no words came. The room felt like it was spinning. Her mouth went dry. He asked me to," she finally whispered. "He begged me. He said he just wanted peace, just one day. He thought he'd never see you again." Alina scoffed. "And you just did it? Just like that? Played house with a dying man you didn't even know?" Victoria's voice cracked. "He wasn't just any man. He was broken. He just wanted closure, and I didn't do it for money. I didn't take anything." Alina's jaw clenched. Her hands trembled at her sides. "You didn't take anything? You signed my name on legal documents. You took everything. Do you even know what that means? The media, the board of directors, the inheritance lawyers. You think this is just a sweet little lie you can undo?" Victoria flinched. "I didn't want it to go that far." "Well, it did," Alina snapped. Mr. Kemp tried to interject. "Ms. Langston, please understand. Your father is very ill. He may not have had the capacity—" "Oh, he had capacity," Alina interrupted. "He knew exactly what he was doing. He was punishing me." That caught Victoria off guard. "What?" Alina crossed her arms, her tone colder now. "He was trying to hurt me. One final lesson, I guess. This is what you get for staying away. He found someone to replace me, to love him on his deathbed while I stayed the villain." "I'm not trying to replace anyone," Victoria said quietly. But Alina was already walking toward the door. "You have no idea what kind of man my father really is," she said. "You think he's this fragile soul with regrets and soft apologies. He's a master manipulator. He built an empire by crushing people under his feet. He doesn't know how to love." Victoria stood frozen. Alina paused in the doorway. "He used you, just like he used everyone else." The door shut behind her. Back in room 807, Jonathan's breathing was shallow. His nurse had informed the staff he might not make it through the night. But when Victoria entered, he opened his eyes, weak but awake. "You came back," he said, a whisper. "Alina was here," Victoria said softly, sitting beside him. Jonathan's face barely moved. No surprise, no panic. "She knows everything," Victoria added. "She's furious." He turned his head slowly toward her. "Good. Good," she echoed, stunned. Jonathan gave a faint smile. "Now she'll feel something again. Anger is better than silence. I needed her to feel." Victoria stood up, her voice rising. "You used me. You lied to me just like you lied to her." "I never lied," he said calmly. "I told you exactly what I wanted, and you gave it to me." "I thought you were a broken man looking for peace," she whispered, shaking her head. "But you're just lonely and cruel." He looked up at her, unflinching. "Cruel? Maybe. But I gave you something too, Victoria. You played the part better than you think." She stared at him, stunned. "Don't act like you didn't." "Feel it," he said. For one day you had a father." She left without another word. Victoria didn't go back to work the next day. She sat in her tiny apartment, curled up on the worn-out couch with a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago. Her phone had rung 3 times that morning: hospital HR, her direct supervisor, and an unknown number that she didn't need to guess was a lawyer. She didn't answer any of them. She kept replaying everything in her head: the way Jonathan had looked at her, the way Alina's words had sliced into her. "You didn't just lie. You took everything." It wasn't supposed to spiral this far. It was just one day of pretending. But the line between what was real and what was performed had gotten too blurry. Somewhere between holding his hand and hearing him say, "Thank you, Alina," Victoria had started to believe the lie too. She didn't want the money. She didn't want the attention. But now it didn't matter. She was the face of a scandal, and the world was about to find out. That afternoon, the first headline hit the internet. "Nurse impersonates billionaires. Her strange daughter signs away fortune." The article had her name, her face, her hospital, her entire life, stripped bare for clicks and comment sections. By evening, another one followed. "Langston's last betrayal. Daughter says father used nurse to cut her out." And by nightfall, her landlord left a voicemail. "Hey, Victoria. Listen, a reporter came by. I think it's best if you stay somewhere else for a few days, just till things calm down." She didn't sleep that night either, not out of fear, out of shame and confusion and heartbreak for something that wasn't even real. The next morning, she packed a small bag and walked the empty streets to the bus terminal. No idea where she was going, just away. Somewhere no one would know her name. Somewhere she could breathe again. But then her phone rang again. It was a private number. She almost let it ring out, but something made her swipe the screen. "Hello? Victoria Hart." The voice was sharp, professional. "This is Marcus Dorian, lead counsel for the Langston family estate. I need to speak with you immediately, in person." "I'm not part of the family," she said bitterly, "and I'm not signing anything else." "I'm not calling about legal documents," he replied. "Jonathan Langston passed away this morning. You're mentioned in his final video, Will." Her legs froze. "What?" she stammered. "He recorded it last night," Marcus said. "We're assembling everyone for a private viewing. The press doesn't know yet. I suggest you be there." "Why me?" she whispered. "Because whatever he left behind, it's going to involve you, one way or another." The Langston estate was a fortress of stone and steel, tucked behind security gates and towering trees. Victoria arrived in a black car sent by Marcus himself. She felt like a trespasser in a kingdom she didn't belong to. Inside, everything was cold, clinical, the home of a man who had built everything and trusted no one. Alina was already there, standing by a massive fireplace with a glass of red. Wine she hadn't touched. Her face was unreadable, arms crossed like shields. Victoria hesitated. I'm sorry," she said softly. Alina looked at her, eyes hollow. "You should be." Marcus cleared his throat from the doorway. "Let's begin." They sat in a sleek modern room with a screen mounted on the wall. Marcus pressed a button on the remote, and the video began to play. Jonathan Langston appeared on screen, gaunt and pale, but his voice was steady. "If you're watching this," he began, "I'm gone." He looked directly into the camera, then down at something in his lap before continuing. "To Alina, I failed you. I built my empire on silence and distance, and you were the one who paid the price. I wish I could go back and be the father you needed. I wish I could take back every missed call, every birthday I wasn't there for." Alina's eyes didn't move, her lips pressed tightly together. "But I couldn't die knowing we never shared a final moment. So I gave that moment to someone else, a woman who reminded me of who you were, who you could have been with the right love." Victoria swallowed hard, her throat dry. "She pretended to be you, but she did more than pretend. She listened, she forgave, she gave me peace." Jonathan looked down again, his expression softer. "To Victoria Hart I leave a personal trust, $2 million to be used however she sees fit. She earned nothing from me, yet gave everything." Victoria gasped, covering her mouth. Alina's head snapped toward her, eyes wide with disbelief. "And as for the estate," Jonathan continued, "I have amended the documents. Alina will retain full control. The signature was invalid. It was never about the money." The screen went black. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Alina stood up slowly, her voice barely audible. "He left me everything, and gave you what he never gave me." Victoria stood too. "I didn't ask for this." "No, but you got it anyway." "Take it," Victoria said, shaking her head. "I don't want a cent, not from him." But Alina's face twisted into something bitter. "Then what do you want? Pity? Praise? A lifetime of therapy?" "I want to forget this ever happened," Victoria whispered. Alina took a step toward her. "Then you're lucky, because I'll make sure everyone forgets you." Victoria didn't take the money. She left the mansion that night with her palms shaking and her heart racing, but she didn't touch the trust. She told Marcus Dorian to dissolve it, told him she didn't want anything with the Langston name on it, told him to never contact her again. And for 2 weeks they didn't. The media storm calmed a little, mostly because Alina made sure of it. Her PR team buried the story in legal jargon and vague press releases. They painted Victoria as a misguided but non-malicious nurse involved in a private, personal misunderstanding. No lawsuits, no charges, just silence. But silence, as Victoria had learned, was never empty. It echoed. She went back to her regular shifts at a smaller clinic on the west side of the city, away from the press and the name Langston. She thought maybe, just maybe, she could put it behind her. Until a small envelope arrived one afternoon, no sender, listed. Just her name handwritten in sharp, precise cursive. Inside was a note. "Meet me at room 807 tonight. Come alone." She stared at it for a long time, trying to convince herself it was some kind of sick joke. But something inside, her maybe morbid curiosity, maybe unfinished grief, dragged her back to Harlington Private Hospital. Room 807 had been cleared out after Jonathan's death, sanitized, stripped of his presence. But when she opened the door that night, it wasn't empty. Sitting by the window, arms crossed and staring out into the city lights, was Alina. "I didn't think you'd come," she said without turning. Victoria stepped in slowly. "I wasn't going to, but the note—" Alina held it up. "I sent it. I needed to talk to you." There was no bitterness in her voice now, no venom, just weariness. Victoria didn't sit. She kept her distance, unsure what this was. "Why?" she asked. Alina took a deep breath. "Because I found something, in his study." She turned and tossed a thin leather folder onto the bed. "Go ahead. Open it." Victoria hesitated before stepping forward. And picking it up. Inside were photographs, dozens, black and white at first, then color, baby photos, toddler shots. A girl with dark curls, scraped knees, a gap-toothed smile. Some were labeled, Alina, age 3. Alina, 5th birthday. But then they shifted. The photos after age 10 looked different. A different girl, but similar. Hair straighter, skin just a touch lighter. Something was off. Victoria flipped to the last photo. A young teenager. A date scrawled on the back, 2006. "That's not me," Alina said flatly. "That girl, that's someone else." Victoria looked up, stunned. "Are you saying—" "I think he had another daughter," Alina whispered. "One, no one knew about." Victoria felt the air punch out of her lungs. "I did a background search," Alina continued. "The hospital records list your mother's name, Cassandra Hart." Victoria nodded slowly, her chest tightening. "Your mother worked at Langston Technologies in the late 80s. Admin assistant. Quiet, brilliant. Vanished after a few years. Sound familiar?" Victoria sat down, unable to hold herself up anymore. "You think he was my father?" "I think he knew," Alina said. "I think that's why he chose you. Not because you looked like me, but because you were blood." The room spun. Victoria tried to breathe, but the weight of it crushed her chest. "He left me the company," Alina said quietly. But he left you the only thing he never gave anyone else. Closure. Tears burned at the edge of Victoria's eyes. Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he say anything? Because he was a coward, Alina whispered. He couldn't face what he did. 2 daughters, one abandoned, one resented. Victoria's mind ran wild. Every conversation, every look, every moment in that room suddenly took on a new meaning. He hadn't just been imagining her as Alina. He had seen someone he had actually left behind. A daughter who never even knew he existed. And now he's gone, she said, and I'll never get to ask him why. Alina stood, walking toward her. Her expression wasn't angry anymore. It was something worse. Grief. Understanding. He owed both of us more than this, she said. But maybe we don't have to carry his secrets forever. Victoria looked at her, confused. What do you mean? Alina stepped closer. We don't have to pretend he was a better man than he was. But we can choose what we do with what he left behind. I don't want the money. Good, Alina said, a trace of a smile touching her lips. Then maybe we start with the truth. For the first time since Jonathan Langston's death, Victoria and Alina sat across from each other, without walls between them. The hospital room was dim, quiet, empty, except for the truth that had settled between them like a slow-burning fire. Victoria had never believed in fate, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had always been moving toward this moment, toward him, even in absence. I don't even know what to do with this, Victoria said, staring down at the old photographs again. I mean, if it's true, if he really was my father. Alina leaned back in the chair, exhaling. It's true. You know it. I know it. He knew it. He just never had the guts to say it out loud. But why? Victoria asked. Why keep me a secret? Because that's who he was, Alina said bitterly. He only showed people the parts of himself he could control. Everything else he buried. You were one of those things he didn't want anyone to find. Victoria's throat tightened. I wasn't even worth a mention. He mentioned you, Alina said quietly. He just didn't use your name. Victoria looked up, startled. I went through his letters, his old journals, the ones no one ever read. He talked about a mistake from long ago, a girl, a child he never expected. He called her a ghost. Victoria felt like she'd been slapped. A ghost, Alina nodded. He was haunted, but not enough to do the right thing. Silence fell over them. Outside the window, the city lights blinked like 1,000 unread messages, people going on with their lives, clueless to the storm unraveling inside 2 women who were supposed to be strangers, but now shared the same scar. I can't believe he left me $2 million and still couldn't say the words, Victoria muttered, laughing bitterly. Is that all a daughter was worth to him? Alina was quiet for a long moment. He gave you the only version of love he was capable of. Cold, quiet, and a little too late. Victoria leaned forward. What do I even do now? Go public, write a tell-all, sue the estate? You could, Alina said, but you won't. You're not like him, or me. That last line lingered like smoke. Victoria narrowed her eyes. What's that supposed to mean? Alina looked away, fidgeting with her ring. I'm not sure I ever hated him as much as I pretended to. I think I just wanted him to hurt. The way he made me hurt. So I stayed away. So I let him die angry. Victoria softened. He made that choice, not you. Yeah, but I didn't have to give him silence. I could have picked up the phone. So could he, Victoria said. But he chose a stranger. You're not a stranger, Alina said sharply. You were always closer to him than I ever was, even if you didn't know it. Victoria stood and walked to the window. You think we can actually do anything with this truth? What, bond? Over his mistakes, Alina smirked faintly. Maybe. Or maybe just not let him be the last thing that defines us. They stood there quietly. 2 women, 1 bloodline, 1 history of abandonment, denial, and legacy. I don't want the money, Victoria said again. I know, Alina replied, but you might need it. I'd rather earn my life, not have it handed to me in a coffin. Alina finally rose and walked to her. Then earn it. Use it to become someone who doesn't lie, who shows up, Who tells the truth even when it hurts? Victoria looked at her, really looked at her. That what you're gonna do? Alina gave a faint smile. Trying. For the first time, it wasn't a confrontation. It was something almost like peace. Uneasy, fragile, but real. Before they parted ways that night, Alina said one last thing. You're not a ghost, Victoria, and you don't have to keep pretending to be someone else. Victoria's voice was soft. I think I forgot how to be myself. Then start remembering, Alina said. One day at a time. The next few days passed in a strange blur for Victoria. She didn't return to her old job. She didn't run from the city either. For the first time in years, she was simply still. Caught between two versions of herself, before Jonathan Langston and after him. Her phone buzzed constantly. Reporters still hovered like flies, digging for a new twist in the story. A few gossip blogs claimed she had orchestrated the entire thing to trick a dying billionaire into rewriting his will. The more serious outlets danced around the truth, too scared to accuse, too proud to apologize. And Marcus Dorian, Jonathan's lawyer, kept trying to reach her. On the fifth day, he finally left a voicemail she couldn't ignore. Victoria, you have to come in. There's something Jonathan left for you, privately, something not in the will. She didn't want to know. She told herself she didn't care. But curiosity, the same thing that pulled her into that hospital room in the first place, dragged her to Marcus's office the next morning. He didn't greet her with small talk, just handed her a thick brown envelope, sealed with wax. The old-fashioned kind. Inside a letter, in Jonathan's sharp, narrow handwriting. Victoria, if you're reading this, it means I am exactly what I always feared. Too late. You were never supposed to be part of this. But when I saw you, I knew. My silence had found its consequence. You had her eyes, Cassandra's fire. I knew what I had done. And still I let you play the role. I let you pretend. Because I was too much of a coward to tell the truth myself. You gave me peace. I gave you confusion. I'm sorry. But this isn't about me anymore. It's about you. Inside the envelope is a key. There's a storage unit under the name Cassandra Hart, registered 28 years ago. I never opened it. I was afraid of what she left behind. Maybe that's where your truth lives. Don't let me be your ending. Let me be your beginning. Jonathan Victoria sat frozen. Her eyes didn't blink. Her hands clenched the letter so tight the edges crumpled. A storage unit? She whispered to herself. Marcus nodded. We tracked it. It's still there. Paid up through automatic transfers Jonathan set decades ago. Where? He slid a paper across the desk. An address in a rundown part of the city. One of those warehouse districts with flickering streetlights and the smell of oil in the air. Later that evening she went. She didn't know what she expected. Old baby clothes, a few photos, a letter from her mother explaining the man she ran from. What she found was more than that. The key opened a rusting metal door. Inside was a single wooden trunk, heavy, dust-covered, untouched for nearly 3 decades. When she pried it open, her breath caught. Photos, dozens, of her mother, young, vibrant, alive. And of Jonathan, before the power hardened him. Smiling, laughing, even holding her as a baby. He had known. All along. She picked up one photo. Her mother's handwriting was on the back. Summer, 1993. You said you loved her. So love her. Even if you leave. There were letters, too. Ones her mother had written but never sent. Torn journal entries. Medical documents confirming paternity. Even a faded cassette tape labeled, "For her someday." Victoria sat on the concrete floor, surrounded by pieces of a past she never had. A truth that had been hidden away in a box because 2 people were too broken to face it. She cried. For her mother, for herself, and even, somehow, for Jonathan. When she left the unit that night, she didn't feel like a nurse or a liar or a fraud anymore. She felt like something else entirely. A daughter who finally had the truth. Too late for healing, but just in time for becoming. The following week, Victoria stood outside the towering glass building that bore the Langston name. Not as a nurse. Not as an imposter, but as someone who knew the man behind that name better than most of the people who'd called him Sir. She had the envelope tucked under her arm, photos, letters, and that tape. Not to give away, but to use. For closure. For clarity. She hadn't spoken to Alina since that night at the hospital, but she had sent a short message. I found what he left, and I think you should see it too. Alina responded 2 days later. Come to the tower, tomorrow, 3 p.m. Now Victoria took a breath and stepped inside. The Langston corporate. Headquarters was everything Jonathan had been, grand, intimidating, built to impress. But as she rode the elevator to the 45th floor, she didn't feel small anymore. Not because she had power or money or status, but because she had something none of them did. She had truth. Alina was waiting in her father's old office, seated behind the desk where billion-dollar deals had been made. She wasn't wearing designer black today, just a simple blouse, hair tied back, no makeup. She looked tired but alert. On the desk sat 2 glasses and a bottle of wine already opened. I figured, Alina said, nodding at her, I need something to take the edge off. Victoria smiled faintly. Is this a peace offering? No, Alina said. It's surrender. You win. He was your father too. Victoria sat down and placed the envelope on the table. He was both of ours, in the worst and strangest way. Alina picked up a photo and studied it, the one with Jonathan holding baby Victoria, unaware the moment would be buried in a storage unit for 30 years. My mom always said he wasn't built for family, Alina said, but I didn't know he was out starting secret ones while he wasn't showing up to mine. Victoria looked at her carefully. You're not angry. Oh, I'm furious, Alina said, pouring wine into the glasses. But not at you, not anymore. He made a mess and left us to sweep it up, classic Langston. They clinked glasses, not a toast, more like mutual survival, and drank in silence for a moment. Then Alina said, So, what now? You gonna fight for your piece of the pie? No, Victoria said, I'm not you, I don't want this life. What do you want? Victoria thought for a moment. I want to open a hospice, small, quiet, for people dying alone, people like him, except without the lies, without the need to pretend. Alina blinked. That's noble. No, Victoria said softly. That's healing. She stood to leave, then paused. There's a room in that hospice that'll be named after him, not because he earned it, but because without his mess I'd still be pretending to live. Alina gave a soft laugh. He'd hate that, having his name in a place full of honesty. Good, Victoria said. As she walked toward the door, Alina called after her. You know, he chose you in the end, not just because you were his daughter, but because somehow you still had heart. After everything. Victoria turned. And you had the power to destroy me, but you didn't. They looked at each other, years of pain and betrayal and loss dancing in their eyes. We're not sisters, Alina said, but we're not strangers anymore either. Victoria nodded. We're survivors. And then she left. 6 months later, in a quiet coastal town, a sign was hung on a modest brick building, the Cassandra House, a home for the forgotten. Funded by one truth, built from a lie, and run by a woman who once pretended to be someone's daughter, only to discover she always had been. Not every story ends in love or justice. Some just end in clarity, and sometimes that's enough.